Hey, Compcovers. So we are continuing our society topic, and today we are doing political participation. So this is in the AP Comparative Government Curriculum. This is topic 3.5 and 3.6, and it focuses on political participation, which, by definition, can be voluntary or coerced. Realize that participation can be compulsory, and it may occur at the individual or group level. It can range from behaviors supportive of a regime, or political participation can be oppositional to behavior that wants to change government policy or overthrow a regime in the form of protests. So, supportive of a regime or oppositional to a regime. So, what I'm doing I don't know if you've noticed this with my vocabulary, is to give you language to use when you're doing your FRQs. All right, so certain political conditions make it more likely that citizens will engage in violent political behavior, including when citizens feel that more conventional options for political participation are not effective. So when things like voting or things like rallies are not being dealt with by the government, being ignored by the government, then sometimes citizens will engage in violent political behavior. An example of that is the 1979 Iranian Revolution, right? They overthrew the government of the Shah because they felt that the Shah was not listening to the will of the people. All right, there is formal political participation, and it includes voting, casting ballots. And formal participation, political participation, can be encouraged across different types of regimes, from democratic regimes to authoritarian regimes. So, authoritarian regimes can have formal political participation or voting, right? Kind of like Russia has, even though it may be illegitimate. All right, formal participation can enhance legitimacy, can give legitimacy to a regime, whether it's authoritarian or democratic. Formal political participation can gather input, right? So how do people vote on a certain issue? What is their tendency on particular issues? Formal political participation can act as a safety valve, which is basically the idea that with the amount of voter participation, there is a sense of safety to implementing those policies. Or can apply a check on governmental policies. So sometimes you vote against a measure that was proposed by the government. Though authoritarian regimes are more likely to use citizen participation to intimidate opposition or give an illusion of influence, kind of like Russia, while democratic regimes hold elections to allow citizens a political voice. Okay, one way to allow citizens a political voice in policymaking is a referendum. And the plural, I believe, is a referenda. So it allows citizens to vote directly on a policy question. So do you vote yay or nay on Brexit, right? So that's a policy position. Do you vote yay or nay? And so citizens of the UK were able to vote whether they wanted to remain in the European Union or exit the European Union. Referendums in general are used for a variety of reasons, including as a means to promote democratic policymaking. So, to vote yay or nay on a policy position, to allow the chief executive to bypass the legislature and go directly to the citizens. So if they put it before, say a president or a prime minister is putting something up there that is not fully supported by a Democratic, in the United States, I'm giving you an example, a Democratic president with a Republican Congress may bypass the Congress and go directly to the people. So that's one thing. And referendums are used to oblige citizens to make difficult and potentially unpopular decisions on public policy. And that's why Brexit happened, right? Legislators didn't want to have to make the decision. They rather put it before the people. All right, and I've made many examples of the UK in a referendum. So 3.6 are forces that impact political participation. So some of those forces are the regimes themselves, whether you are an authoritarian regime or a democratic regime. They have an impact on political participation. For both of these types of regime, they both support similar forms of participation to influence policy, like voting. Voting is something that both authoritarian and democratic regimes use. A similarity, but a difference is in how much impact the citizen has on those policies. And policy making based on how open and competitive the election. So you can have an election, you can vote on something, but how fair is said election? How competitive is said election? And so in authoritarian regimes, sometimes they are not so fair, and that may lead to, an impact on political participation. Like in Nigeria, that is an authoritarian, but it's also technically a democratic, regime. But people don't really participate because of the history of corruption and the lack of competitiveness in the elections. All right, in many elections in authoritarian regimes, there are few, if any, oppositional candidates. So like in Iran, where the Ayatollah gets to take out any candidates that they do not feel is worthy. So again, that is not very competitive in terms of an election. So oppositional candidates, let's use that as a vocabulary term. Those are candidates running for some sort of office that advocates differing views from that of the controlling party or the elite. So are oppositional candidates allowed to run for office? In Russia, no. Navalny is an example of an oppositional candidate who, is not allowed to run. All right, and then the government often intervenes in these elections to ensure that its preferred candidates and its preferred parties win. So United Russia, in other words, in Russia or in Iran, it's those who were put on the ballot because they were preferred by the Ayatollah. All right, so we have now informal participation. So we have formal participation, that's voting. Now we have informal participation. This is protests and other types of political criticism. It could be, written down in books or articles in the newspaper or in magazines or social media, whether it's in Twitter or all the other various social media that you all know way more about than I do. So that's informal participation. And it's treated differently from regime to regime. In authoritarian regimes, there's less tolerance for critical viewpoints in the informal participation. Both authoritarian and democratic regimes regulate formal political participation by placing restrictions on voting access. So it's possible for a democratic regime to place restrictions on voting access. Take the United States, for example, that there's been movements to make voting a little more difficult, and that places restrictions on voting access. Same thing historically in the United States, where African Americans were not allowed to vote. So democratic regimes can place restrictions on voting access. And disallowing disruptive and violent protests. So some democratic regimes allow protests, but when it gets to a certain point, they will try and bring about peace and, elimination of the chaos. Authoritarian regimes are kind of infamous for doing this. So authoritarian regimes manage and limit citizen participation to a greater extent than democratic regimes. So authoritarian regimes tolerate, to some degree, some more than others, mass political protests. Here's another term you can use, mass political protest, and movements less than democratic regimes do. And the reason that authoritarian regimes tolerate them less is because they value public order more than they do individual rights and individual liberties. All right, so here's some words you can be using in your FRQs. And notice that's what I do with these vocabulary parts at the beginning of each video, is to basically give you a vocabulary to speak with. All right, so let's start with our case studies. Political participation in the UK is high. Voting behavior is pretty good, above 60%, usually around the 70% mark. There is also high percentages of qualified voters who go to the polls. Qualified voters who go to the polls. And the Brits, they participate in national elections, used to participate in supranational elections like the EU Parliament, but no longer. And they do also participate in local and regional elections. So elections happen from the bottom all the way up to the top, unlike China, which is only in the most local of levels. Another type of political participation that is popular in the UK is is referendums, like Brexit, like the Scottish independence, right, that happened in 2014. Brexit was 2016. And we all know about Brexit. So here's an example of a referendum. And in terms of political participation and formal political participation, one of the characteristics of the UK is that it has gradually democratized over centuries, right? Bringing about voting rights or more formal political participation. And I give you a little history here. Starting with the Industrial Revolution, this is going to empower merchants, businessmen, and industrialists over the aristocratic landowners. And so this merchant class is going to start to gain power in the House of Commons and therefore start to enact legislature that benefits the merchant or middle class. And we see, as a result of that, these various pieces of legislation passing the House of Commons: the Great Reformation Act, the Representation of the People's Act, the Franchise Act of 1884, the Representation of the People Act 1918, and now finally this is essentially universal manhood suffrage and female suffrage. All adult male and female over 30 could vote. And then we started to see the decline in the House of Lords, which was an aristocratic body. Now it's mostly appointed. And in England, 18-year-olds and over. England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, 18 or older can vote. And Scotland, 16-year-olds can vote. All right, let's move on to Russia. This looks depressing, doesn't it? Okay, so participation is declining and is fraudulent. Voter turnout is around 67% in the 2018 election, but in the congressional elections, the Duma elections, 47%, and declining. And sometimes we wonder if those voter turnouts are legit, because there could be a lot of fraud associated with it. And there's also a lot of corruption. Nemtsov, a political opponent to Putin, was shot. He was an oppositional, right, candidate, one of our vocabulary terms. And Nemtsov was shot and killed near the Kremlin in 2015. So again, oppositional candidates are taken out. Navalny, as we said, was arrested multiple times. So there is definitely some corruption associated with elections, and people lose faith in it. And when people lose faith in elections, we see voter turnout declining. Similarly, the NGOs has consistently dropped since 2012. The presidential elections for Putin that have been particularly pointed out as fraudulent is the 2012 and the 2018 election. International organization known as the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe monitored this election and reported that there was ballot stuffing in the 2012 election, so in December 2011, and Putin has essentially taken out all of his competitors, so that they have marked it as being poor. All right, and you can kind of see here over time the voter turnout. All right, let's go to China. So China's participation is through the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and the Chinese Communist Party Youth. And that's how you participate. It's called mass organization. The Communist Party very purposefully builds organizations within the CCP and CCP Youth that will channel any desire for you to voice any kind of issues that you may have through the Communist Party, and therefore it is controlled by the Communist Party. So these mass organizations are organizations in a Communist Party that represents the interest of a particular social group, such as workers or women, but which are controlled by the Communist Party. The state party tries to prevent the formation of independent groups, no independent groups, they must be dependent on the CCP, by forming mass organizations in which people may express these viewpoints, but within strict limits. All right, and these groups exist to strengthen the power of the CCP and serve as channels for the party. Participation in elections in the formal participation is local only. Remember, that is various upper bodies, then those bodies vote for people into the body above them. The CCP is the largest party in the world at 85 million. The CCP youth has 73 million, so that is of importance. Cadres, I forgot to turn that into red, but cadres are essentially, in a communist party system, people in positions of power. And so cadres include Mao, and Mao put into his administration people from the Long March. But since Mao died and Deng Xiaoping started to institute his reforms, we're starting to see a new type of person in Chinese government. At the highest levels of Chinese government, and that's technocrats. Technocrats are intellectuals and professional people with appropriate technical skills and training. And so a lot of them are economists and engineers and that kind of thing, because there has been a shift away from ideology and towards pragmatism in China. Okay, so Mexico. Mexico's political participation is characterized by revolution, protest, and voting. So they have a relatively good voter turnout at 63% in the 2018 election. Voting is compulsory. That means it is a law. You must vote, but it's not enforced. And I will tell you that after a history of authoritarian rule by the political elite who value order over individual freedom and liberty, today participation is now really through protest and elections. So, as opposed to revolution. What's really big in Mexico, and, there is some debate about whether this is good or not, is the patronage, or the patron-client system, meaning the same thing. And this was largely through the dominant party known as PRI, or the PRI. And in Mexico, these patron-client systems, or patronage, known as camarillas. And that's just a dialectally appropriate term in Mexico. And that is exchanging favors and rewards and offices for your support, right? So, but with the PRI, or the PRI-party, losing its dominant status, we're starting to see more oppositional groups rise up, including the Morena Party, which won the presidency in 2018. Alrighty. Political participation in Nigeria. It's not active, largely due to party. They also have falling voter turnout. And this is because of, again, just like Russia, ballot fraud and corruption. Now, they do have an organization known as the INEC, which is a voting oversight committee to oversee elections in Nigeria. And it was an attempt at democratization, and it has improved voting in Nigeria. As a matter of fact, they do have new technologies now in voting, like scanners and fingerprint scanners and that kind of thing, to make sure that you are who you say you are. But because of the history of voter fraud, Nigerians do not trust their government, and as a result are largely skeptical about voting. So examples of corruption in voting: the Babangida, one of the military generals who was part of their long history of military dictatorships, annulled the 1993 democratic election. And of course, that just gives elections in Nigeria illegitimacy. And that was in 1993. In 1998, another military dictator, Abacha, When he unexpectedly died, there was rejoicing in the streets in 1998, and they called it a coup from heaven because this political leader was so unpopular, so undemocratic, right? So distrust in their government is one of the reasons for a lack of political participation, in addition to poverty. There is some protests. Remember MOSOP and MEND, the Ken Saro-Wiwa. It does receive a low ranking in terms of corruption for Transparency International. And Nigeria is not yet a democracy. It is struggling to democratize. And despite a long history of pre-Columbian rich civil society, its citizens have been encouraged to relate to government as subjects, not as active participants. So whether they were under British occupation or under the various dictatorships post-1960, they have been encouraged to act as subjects, not as participants. If they do participate, there is some degree of protest, yes, and there's also patron-client systems like we saw in Mexico. And again, it's the idea that if you give party loyalty or if you give government loyalty, then the government will reward you with jobs or benefits or rewards of some kind. Local government officials gain support of villagers by dispensing these favors. In turn, they receive favors for supporting their patron bosses. Civilians will. Most favors are exchanged by political elite, although these favors do go all the way down to the village level, but mostly exchanged among political elite, which brings up the idea of prebendalism. It's personalized system of rule in which all public offices are treated as personal fiefdoms. So you benefit from your office, and personally you benefit, usually financially. And as a result, all this corruption is leading Nigerians to not participate in their government. All right, and you can see here, voter turnout declining. All right, so let's go to our last country, Iran. So Iran has a high voter turnout, particularly among the young, and that's because the young have a lot more invested. The young are also more active. And even though the 1979 Constitution guarantees civil rights and liberties, the Islamic Republic has, in the past, closed down newspapers, labor unions, private organizations, political parties, particularly under the Mahmoud Ahmadinejad regime in the late 1990s and early 2000s. I will tell you that there is a high degree of participation through protests. Much of the population is young, so they do tend to take to the streets. 50% of the population is under 35 and is most likely to protest. So we have seen a lot of protests against the headscarf or the hijab for women, as you can see here. And most recently, the Iranian people have taken to the streets in protest against their government because of the downed Ukrainian passenger plane that was taken down by the Iranian government accidentally. And at first they denied, but then they came out and said, yeah, we did it, and our bad. And this was over the drone American killing of one of their very popular generals, Soleimani. So 70% in 2017 voter turnout, again, pretty high. And recruitment is often through whether you participated in the 1979 revolution actively or a religious leader. All right, CompGovers, we will do media tomorrow. Take care.